Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith is day 196. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 156 and 157 of the Secundae, that is, of Incontinence and of Clemency and Meekness. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code Summa 10, and so here we go. Article 1, whether incontinence pertains to the soul or to the body. Although it is common to use the word incontinence as applied to the body, we are speaking here of that which pertains to the soul, as St. Thomas teaches. The direct cause of incontinence is on the part of the soul, which fails to resist a passion by the reason. This is what we mean by incontinence, but how exactly is it that a man could fail to resist some passion contrary to reason? For example, if a man decided to fast on a Wednesday for the glory of God and the salvation of souls, including his very own, but when Wednesday came around, found himself eating 3 meals a day contrary to what he had resolved to do. And a fall like this can occur in 2 ways. First, if the will suddenly and quickly yield to some passion without really thinking it over, like if a man were to walk into a room with donuts in it and just begin to eat them without any serious deliberation, this is termed unbridled incontinence or impetuosity. Then there is, like in our example, when a man has already deliberated and firmly judged the right course of action, but when the time came, thought otherwise due to the sway of passion. This kind of incontinence is called weakness. From either perspective, from either kind of incontinence, it is clear that such pertains to the soul instead of the body. Article 2, whether incontinence is a sin, as it is written in the second letter to Timothy, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control. Without self-control is our layman's term for incontinence, and it is a sin because to act incontinently by definition entails acting against the rule of reason, in this case under the sway of passion specifically. Article 3, whether the incontinent man sins more gravely than the intemperate. To become intemperate as a vice, to possess this bad, stable, firm quality requires the engagement of the will in intemperate action and likely repeated action over time in order to truly possess the vice in the concupiscible passions, which we're calling intemperance, which is quite grave. The incontinent man, on the other hand, need not have lived such a life to merely be weak-willed under the sway of some chance impulse of passion. In Aquinas' words, where there is a greater inclination of the will to sin, there is a graver sin. Now, in the intemperate man, the will is inclined to sin in virtue of its own choice, which proceeds from a habit acquired through custom, whereas in the incontinent man, the will is inclined to sin through a passion. Hence it follows that the intemperate man is much worse than the incontinent. Article 4, whether the incontinent in anger is worse than incontinent in desire. Is it worse to give way to anger or to give way to desire? Aquinas teaches that the man who gives way to pleasure, to desire, is worse. And that makes sense, first of all, because anger is kind of an intellectual thing, not strictly speaking, because we see even dogs growl and bare their fangs in anger. Even on their part, there is required a pseudo-act of judgment in order to get angry, not like our judgments informed by the intellect, but for them, their anger comes from an external sense coupled with the kind of knowing which is internal, what we call instinct, or more specifically, the estimative sense. So succumbing to pleasure is in a way less rational, less human, requires less of some kind of intellectual capacity, knowing capacity, than succumbing to anger is, and thus it is more shameful. Then setting aside Aquinas' argument based on the heat of the body and the passion of anger, which may not hold up with contemporary biology, he then gives us a third and fourth reason why anger is less shameful. Because anger seeks to work openly, whereas concupiscence is feigned to disguise itself and creeps in by stealth. And fourthly, because he who is subject to concupiscence works with pleasure, whereas the angry man works as though forced by a certain previous displeasure. And lastly, it's good to mention, as St. Thomas does here, that if we compare incontinence of anger to incontinence of desire, anger may be considered more grievous from the perspective that it can lead to more grievous evils such as murder and the like. Now on to question 157 of clemency and meekness. And why are we talking about clemency and meekness next? And it's because we're going through the virtues annexed to temperance, virtues which are like temperance in that they imply a kind of restraining of an appetite, which temperance does as well, but they're unlike temperance in the aspect of the appetite exactly which they are restraining. So Article 1, whether clemency and meekness are absolutely the same. Meekness moderates the passion of anger. It curbs anger in the irascible appetite, taming it, so to speak, habitually under reason. Yet since anger has to do with vengeance, that's what the passion is about, avenging some injury, then following the passion, there will also be this temptation to overstep the actual act or degree of punishment dealt out. Hence, we have a virtue curbing the feeling and another restraining the action or the severity of vengeance taken on another. In a word from St. Thomas, meekness, insofar as it restrains the onslaught of anger, concurs with clemency towards the same effect, yet they differ from one another, inasmuch as clemency moderates external punishment, while meekness properly mitigates the passion of anger. Article 2, whether both clemency and meekness are virtues. Virtues are what make a man good in his work good, and thus by tempering anger in man and restraining overdoing some punishment, these are both good things, and thus we can say that clemency and meekness are virtues. But allowing Aquinas to teach us here, he tells us moral virtue consists in the subjugation of appetite to reason. Clemency in mitigating punishment is guided by reason, and meekness likewise moderates anger according to right reason. Wherefore it is manifest that both clemency and meekness are virtues. Article 3, whether the aforesaid virtues are parts of temperance. Yes, they are annexed parts of temperance. They fall short of the greatness of temperance, which augments the most unruly, vehement of desires, which are those pleasures related to touch. Yet they are similar to temperance in that clemency and meekness in their own right curb or temper back anger when it comes to meekness, and the desired degree of punishment when it comes to clemency. Thus, meekness and clemency are indeed annexed parts of temperance. Article 4, whether clemency and meekness are the greatest virtues. And setting aside the fact that these virtues are not going to be greater than faith, hope, and charity, which are supernatural, they have God for their object, they will also not be greater than virtues whose object is the good in question, since these deal with restraining some evil, and the latter is for the sake of the former. Lastly, clemency and meekness are annexed virtues, and thus they're not even going to be considered greater than their principal virtue, which is temperance. So in short, clemency and meekness are not the greatest virtues. And with that, we close another episode. We have just finished covering questions 156, 157 of the Secundae, that is, of incontinence, and of clemency and meekness. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.